Let's start with the obvious but often unstated truth. Taiwan matters to America, and not just as a talking point in foreign policy circles. It matters because what happens there will test whether deterrence in the 21st century still means anything. If Beijing can swallow Taiwan by coercion or force, then every ally from Tokyo to Warsaw will read that message loud and clear. American power is negotiable, American commitments are conditional, and American deterrence can be bluffed. I'll tell you, this deterrence isn't an abstraction. It's the hard calculus that keeps ambitious adversaries in check. It's the aircraft carrier in the Strait, the logistics line that never breaks, the unspoken belief in Beijing that the cost of aggression will outweigh the glory of conquest. That belief, once shattered, is almost impossible to rebuild. So why is Taiwan such a pressure point? Start with geography. It sits like a cork between the East and South China Seas, anchoring what strategists call the first island chain. If the Chinese Communist Party controlled Taiwan, it could project military power deep into the Pacific, threaten Japan's sea lanes, and isolate the Philippines. Every freedom of navigation patrol we conduct, every trade route that carries American goods across the Pacific would suddenly operate under Beijing's shadow. Then consider economics. Taiwan produces roughly 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced chips, the tiny, intricate circuits that run our fighter jets, smartphones, and satellites. Imagine a world where China commands that supply. Think about what that would mean for American innovation, for our defense industry, for every family relying on technology from cars to pacemakers. It would give the Chinese Communist Party a chokehold on the modern economy, and the world would have to come begging. But there's another reason Taiwan matters, and it's moral. It's a thriving democracy in the shadow of tyranny, a place where citizens vote, criticize their leaders, and live freely. They built that freedom under constant threat. That courage deserves more than admiration. It deserves strategic respect. If we allow a free people to be crushed because we fear confrontation, we invite aggression everywhere. Now, Beijing knows all this. Xi Jinping doesn't hide his intent. He calls reunification inevitable, uses exercises and cyber attacks to sap Taiwan's morale, and tests our resolve inch by inch. He believes time is on his side, that America is divided, distracted, and declining. I reject that. But belief alone doesn't deter an adversary. Deterrence takes credibility, and credibility demands action. Over the next few sections, we're going to unpack that action, what China's building, how Taiwan is responding, and what America must do to ensure that the Pacific doesn't become the next Ukraine. Because the question isn't whether war is coming. The question is whether deterrence can hold long enough to keep peace real, not just rhetorical. China's military strategy toward Taiwan has entered what defense analysts now call the coercion phase. That means they're testing every instrument of power, short of war, cyber intrusions, psychological warfare, disinformation, and encirclement exercises, all designed to make the island feel isolated and defenseless before a single shot is fired. You and I both know this is not a sudden development. It's the product of 20 years of planning. Since the early 2000s, the People's Liberation Army has undergone one of the fastest military buildups in modern history, new naval destroyers every few months, hypersonic missile systems, and integrated drone swarms capable of overwhelming coastal defenses. This isn't for show, it's preparation. Just this month, Reuters reported that Chinese warships conducted joint blockade drills with aircraft simulating missile strikes around Taiwan's eastern flank. Satellite imagery, as the Wall Street Journal confirmed, shows mock-ups of Taiwanese ports and runways built deep in China's desert for invasion training. Beijing doesn't even bother to hide it anymore. They're broadcasting a psychological message. We can take you whenever we want. Here's what worries me. China doesn't need to invade Taiwan to subjugate it. A blockade could be enough. By choking off energy imports, cutting internet cables, and paralyzing trade, they could suffocate the island into submission. Taiwan imports 97% of its energy. Block those tankers for even 2 weeks, and factories grind to a halt, hospitals start rationing power, and panic spreads. A siege could achieve what an invasion cannot control without destruction. And notice how methodically Beijing is shaping the narrative. Each exercise, each cyber attack, each economic sanction is framed as a response to U.S. arms sales, to Taiwanese elections, to visits from American lawmakers. It's a pattern of escalation disguised as defense. The message to the world is, we're the ones being provoked. That's propaganda at scale, and it's working. Inside China, state media repeats the idea that Taiwan is already Chinese territory and that reunification will happen peacefully if possible, forcibly if necessary. Outside China, diplomats push one China language into every communique. The goal is to make resistance look abnormal, to turn international law on its head. Now, deterrence is about perception as much as capability. If Xi believes the United States lacks the will to intervene, that we're too risk-averse, too distracted by domestic division, he will test that theory. Dictators always do. And if we fail that test, others are watching. The Kremlin, Tehran, Pyongyang, all of them, they measure American resolve by how we respond to our adversaries, not by what we say on the Senate floor. That's why clarity matters. The U.S. must make it unmistakably clear that aggression against Taiwan will carry intolerable costs. That doesn't mean shouting threats. It means structuring our posture, our alliances, our sanctions, our forward deployment so that Beijing understands the price tag of war. Deterrence at its core is not about matching force with force. It's about shaping calculation. So the real question for policymakers and for every American listening is this: are we still capable of projecting credible deterrence? Not just through our military, but through our unity, our will, and our readiness to defend what we say we value? When you look at Taiwan today, you see a society that understands what it means to live under the shadow of an existential threat and still chooses freedom. Every morning, young men and women commute to factories that power the global tech economy, knowing that just across 100 miles of water sits a military machine designed to erase their way of life. That kind of courage deserves more than words. It deserves tangible support. Taiwan's leadership has stopped pretending that time alone will guarantee safety. They're investing heavily in asymmetric defense, mobile anti-ship missiles, coastal radar networks, and unmanned systems capable of harassing a superior force. In September, the Ministry of Defense announced plans to raise spending to 5% of GDP by 2030, a staggering commitment for an island of just 23 million people. To put that in perspective, many NATO members still struggle to reach 2%. Taiwan's not waiting for rescue. It's preparing to fight smart. Let me be blunt. The era of relying solely on American protection is over. Taiwan's survival depends on making an invasion too costly for China to contemplate. That means investing in what the military calls porcupine defense. You can't stop a bear from attacking, but you can make sure it regrets the bite. They're doing it step by step. Taiwan has deployed new Skybo 3 air defense batteries, improved its coastal fortifications, and increased live fire training for reserve units. They're also overhauling their conscription system, extending service time, and raising standards after years of criticism. These are not symbolic gestures. They're a signal of seriousness. But deterrence isn't built on weapons alone. It's built on will. President Lai Ching-te's administration has framed this year's national defense strategy around resilience, ensuring that even if communications are cut and ports are blockaded, the government and society can function. They're investing in backup power grids, emergency food reserves, and redundant command networks. Think about that. They're preparing not just to fight, but to survive under siege. You and I should see that as a reminder. Free nations must learn to live with the responsibility of their freedom. They can't outsource it to Washington or Brussels or anyone else. We can and should help, but deterrence starts at home. And here's the irony. While Taiwan tightens its defenses, Western companies are still deep in China's supply chains. Some American firms continue to invest in mainland semiconductor assembly, effectively funding the very economy that threatens our ally. That's not just short-sighted, it's dangerous. Economic dependence and strategic deterrence can't coexist forever. In the past year, we've seen Taiwan quietly diversify, shifting investments to Southeast Asia, India, and even back to the U.S. through the CHIPS Act framework. It's a smart move, but it's not enough unless Washington matches that seriousness with speed. We can't spend 3 years debating export licenses while Beijing builds new airstrips on artificial islands. At the end of the day, deterrence is a shared enterprise. It's not the job of the Pentagon alone or of Taipei's generals. It's the collective effort of democracies that understand what's at stake, a world where might makes right, or one where law still restrains ambition. So as we turn to the U.S. side of this equation, the tools, the posture, the choices, remember this: Taiwan is not waiting for us. They're already on the wall, holding the line. The question is whether we'll stand beside them before the storm breaks. When I talk about deterrence, I don't mean slogans or press releases. I mean the cold, deliberate mechanics of power, the visible and invisible structures that convince an adversary that aggression will fail. And let's be honest, deterrence is not just about threatening punishment. It's about demonstrating preparedness. It's about showing every single day that the United States has the capability and the will to act. Over the last month, Washington has been quietly adjusting its Indo-Pacific posture. The Pentagon's nominee for Indo-Pacific policy, a strong voice for forward deterrence, told Congress that Taiwan should aim to spend at least 10% of its defense budget on rapid response capabilities and counter-missile systems. That's not hawkish rhetoric, it's realism. The Chinese Communist Party respects strength, not sentiment. We need to remember what deterrence looks like in practice. It's pre-positioned munitions in Guam and the Philippines. It's rotational forces in Japan and Australia that can move within hours, not weeks. It's the U.S. Navy maintaining freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait, not to provoke China, but to affirm that international waters remain free. Deterrence also means hardening our own networks. Cyber warfare will be the first front in any Taiwan conflict. The PLA has spent years mapping U.S. and allied infrastructure. If our logistics systems, satellites, or command networks go dark in the first 48 hours of a crisis, it won't matter how many ships we have, we'll be blind. That's why cyber deterrence must become as central as nuclear deterrence once was. Now, some in Washington like to talk about strategic ambiguity, the idea that keeping China guessing about our intentions helps maintain stability. I get the argument. But I'll tell you, this ambiguity is not the same as indecision. We can be clear about principles, even if we're flexible about tactics. The principle must be this: any attempt to take Taiwan by force will meet an organized, unified, and devastating response, period. At the same time, deterrence isn't a solo act. America's credibility grows when our allies act with us. When Japan revises its defense strategy, when Australia expands its submarine fleet under AUKUS, when the Philippines reopens bases to U.S. forces, that's deterrence in action. It signals to Beijing that the cost of aggression isn't bilateral, it's multilateral. And I'll say this as plainly as I can: our goal is not war. The purpose of deterrence is peace. The purpose of a strong military is to prevent conflict, not to start it. But peace without strength is fantasy. The world is safer when America is strong, consistent, and unafraid to defend its friends. So as we think about deterrence in the Pacific, let's shed the illusion that engagement alone will temper authoritarian ambition. It didn't stop Putin in Ukraine. It won't stop Xi in Taiwan. What will stop him is a coalition that's ready economically, militarily, and morally to resist coercion. In the next section, I'll talk about that coalition, how our allies, from Tokyo to Canberra, are quietly reshaping the balance of power in the Pacific, and why their resolve might be the single greatest factor keeping peace today. If deterrence is to mean anything in the Pacific, it cannot rest solely on American shoulders. It has to live in the choices of our allies: Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, even smaller states like Singapore and Vietnam, nations that understand their freedom depends on a stable Pacific. And here's the remarkable thing: for the first time in decades, they're acting like it. Let's start with Japan. After 70 years of self-imposed restraint, Tokyo is transforming its defense policy at a pace no one thought possible. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party, under a new and more hawkish generation of leaders, has endorsed counter-strike capabilities, meaning Japan can hit missile launch sites on enemy soil if threatened. That's a sea change. I've spoken with Japanese diplomats who admit privately they no longer trust words alone to keep the peace. They've watched what happened in Ukraine, and they know that geography doesn't forgive hesitation. Australia, too, has shed its old complacency. Through the AUKUS partnership with the U.S., and the UK, Canberra is building nuclear-powered submarines that can patrol vast stretches of the Indo-Pacific. Those boats aren't offensive weapons. They're insurance policies. They tell Beijing, if you move on Taiwan, your lines of communication, your energy routes, your naval dominance are all suddenly vulnerable. Then there's the Philippines. Under President Marcos Jr., Manila has done something remarkable, reopened key bases to U.S. forces for the first time in 30 years. That gives the U.S. and its allies a southern flank for deterrence. It means any attempt by China to cut off Taiwan would risk confrontation on multiple fronts. In short, the chessboard is changing, and for once, it's not Beijing moving all the pieces. Now, I want to stress something important here. The goal of this coalition is not to encircle China or to humiliate it. The goal is to prevent miscalculation, to make aggression look so costly, so self-defeating, that it never happens. That's the essence of deterrence. Convincing your adversary that peace is the better bet, but deterrence only works if the alliance holds firm, and that's where the challenge lies. Every capital has its politics, its industries tied to Chinese trade, its media questioning why they should risk war over a distant island. Beijing knows this and exploits it masterfully. They use economic coercion tariffs, tourism bans, supply chain threats to divide us. Just ask Australia what happened when they called for a COVID investigation. China tried to crush them economically. It didn't work, but it was a warning. That's why the U.S. has to lead with consistency. We can't lecture allies one day and undercut them the next. If we say we'll defend the Pacific Order, our trade policy, our tech policy, our military commitments all need to reinforce that message. Words without alignment are noise, and dictators thrive on noise. Let me put it this way. When America leads, alliances grow spine. When we hesitate, they hedge. And hedging invites instability. The Pacific will stay peaceful only if democracies act together, clearly, and early, not react after the fact. In the next section, we'll look at the most dangerous variable of all miscalculation. Because history doesn't always turn on intentions, it turns on mistakes. And in the Taiwan Strait, a single misread signal could light a fire no one can control. The most dangerous word in geopolitics isn't war, it's miscalculation. Wars rarely begin because someone wants them. They begin because someone believes they can get away with something a move too small to trigger retaliation, too smart to provoke the full weight of an adversary's response. And in the Taiwan Strait today, that's the razor's edge we're standing on. Xi Jinping doesn't want a prolonged war with the United States. He wants to win without fighting to coerce Taiwan into surrendering psychologically, politically, or economically. But the more he tests those boundaries, flying jets across the median line, sailing destroyers close to Taiwanese ports, sending spy balloons over sensitive airspace, the greater the risk that one misstep, one misread raider return, turns brinkmanship into disaster. I'll tell you this from studying history. Deterrence is fragile because human pride is fragile. During the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviets came close to catastrophe more than once. A radar glitch, a false alarm, a submarine captain misinterpreting orders, those moments could have changed civilization. The same danger exists in the Pacific today, except with hypersonic missiles, AI targeting, and communication speeds that leave zero room for correction. The truth is, the line between signaling and provocation is thinner than ever. When the U.S. sails a carrier through the strait, Beijing calls it a provocation. When China surrounds Taiwan with warships, they call it an exercise. Both sides say they're maintaining stability, and yet every gesture carries the potential for escalation. That's why clarity matters more than volume. You can't bluff deterrence. You can't posture your way out of miscalculation. If Xi believes the U.S. is unsure, he'll test that uncertainty. If he believes we're resolved, he'll think twice before crossing the line. Simple as that. Here's what worries me deeply. China's leadership bubble. Xi has purged rivals, silenced dissent, and surrounded himself with loyalists who tell him what he wants to hear. That's not strength, it's blindness. Authoritarian systems are terrible at self-correction. They suppress bad news until it explodes. So if Xi misreads American resolve, if he convinces himself that our political divisions mean paralysis, he may take a step he can't reverse. You and I both remember the lessons of history. In 1950, Mao thought America wouldn't defend South Korea. In 1990, Saddam thought we wouldn't defend Kuwait. In 2022, Putin thought NATO wouldn't defend Ukraine's sovereignty. They all miscalculated. They all paid a price. The question is whether Xi believes he's different. Now, there's another layer here, tempo. China operates on what military strategists call salami slicing, advancing inch by inch, so slowly that each move feels tolerable. A few more jets in the airspace, a blockade drill extended by a week, a new customs inspection zone imposed on Taiwan ships. None of these acts alone justify war, but collectively they change the status quo. And by the time we decide it's intolerable, the new normal has already set in. So how do we prevent miscalculation? We maintain presence, we communicate clearly, and we ensure our allies are reading from the same script. Deterrence requires unity of message and speed of response. If Beijing sees hesitation or mixed signals, it will exploit them instantly. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Peace is not a gift of goodwill. It's the byproduct of discipline. And right now, discipline means refusing to be lulled by China's slow motion encroachment. The next crisis won't begin with an invasion. It'll begin with a misunderstanding, one that someone in Beijing or Washington or Taipei believes they can control. In the next section, we'll look at how China could weaponize something even more devastating than missiles, energy, and supply chains, and how the free world can prepare before that chokehold ever tightens. Let's talk about something most Americans don't realize. Taiwan's greatest vulnerability may not be its military at all, it's its energy lifeline. Nearly every barrel of oil, every cubic foot of natural gas that powers the island must travel by sea, and 98% of that supply passes through waters China can control or disrupt within days. If Beijing decided to blockade Taiwan tomorrow, it wouldn't need to fire a single shot. It could just turn the island into an economic hostage. Here's how that would work. China's Navy could declare inspection zones around Taiwan under the guise of safety or environmental checks. Shipping insurers, terrified of risk, would stop covering voyages. Tankers would reroute, ports would empty, and in a week, fuel reserves would plummet. Taiwan's power grid would strain, factories would shut down, and the psychological pressure on its population would be immense. That's not science fiction. It's a page straight from Beijing's current playbook. They've rehearsed it in the South China Sea, cutting off access and daring the world to object. This is what analysts call blockade warfare. It's subtle, deniable, and devastating. And make no mistake, Xi Jinping's military has been preparing for it. They've built a fleet of Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels, not gray warships, but white-painted civilian boats that can enforce a blockade without ever firing. That makes it harder for the world to respond because it doesn't look like war. It looks like bureaucracy with guns. So how does the free world counter that? First, by recognizing that deterrence isn't just about soldiers, it's about supply chains. If Taiwan's fuel, food, and semiconductors can be strangled, then deterrence must include keeping those arteries open. That means pre-positioned energy reserves, redundant cable routes, and joint logistics exercises with partners like Japan and the Philippines. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that U.S. planners are developing contingency routes through Luzon and Okinawa to keep the island supplied under pressure. That's smart, but it needs to accelerate. Second, we need to think in terms of economic deterrence. Imagine if Beijing knew that any attempt to blockade Taiwan would trigger coordinated sanctions on Chinese energy imports, not just by the U.S., but by the G7. That's the kind of pre-declared cost that makes coercion irrational. Sanctions after the fact are punishment. Sanctions pre-committed are deterrence. Third, we have to fix our own dependencies. It's hypocrisy to lecture about Taiwan's vulnerability while we keep our critical supply chains running through mainland China. When American defense components or pharmaceuticals depend on Chinese factories, we've handed Beijing leverage it never earned. The next crisis won't just test our willpower, it'll test our self-sufficiency. And I'll be candid here, energy independence is national security. The same logic that applies at home applies abroad. We can't protect freedom halfway. If we want a stable Pacific, we need to make sure our allies from Taipei to Tokyo have the energy resilience to outlast a blockade. LNG terminals, joint stockpiles, shared infrastructure. That's what 21st century deterrence looks like. But beyond logistics, there's something deeper at play. China's strategy is psychological. They want to convince the Taiwanese people, and by extension, the world, that resistance is futile, that America's support is symbolic, and that economic pain will break the will to fight. That's why our response has to be both material and moral. We must prove that free societies endure pressure better than dictatorships thrive on control. So as we move forward, remember, a blockade isn't just a military event, it's an economic and moral one. If we prepare now, not react later, we can make sure Beijing never even attempts it. In the next section, I'll get to the hard part, America's limits. Because deterrence isn't just about what we can do, it's about what we choose to do when the costs get real. Here's the part we often avoid, what limits the United States in all this. Because deterrence doesn't live in strategy papers, it lives in budgets, in logistics, in the politics of will. And right now, our ability to deter China depends not just on our strength, but on whether we're willing to sustain it. Let's be honest with ourselves. America has global commitments stretching from the Baltic to the Persian Gulf. Our Navy, once the uncontested ruler of the seas, now faces a numbers problem. China's shipyards produce more naval tonnage every 4 years than we can deploy in a decade. Quantity isn't everything. Our ships are more capable, our sailors better trained, but when you're staring down a fleet twice your size in the Western Pacific, numbers start to matter. Then there's distance. The Pacific is vast. Our closest major bases are thousands of miles from Taiwan. That means supply lines, refueling points, and airfields all become targets. Chinese planners understand what we call the tyranny of distance. They've spent 2 decades building anti-access systems, ballistic missiles that can hit ships from inland, radar networks that track every movement in the air. Their goal is simple: to make U.S. intervention too slow, too costly, or too late. Add to that our domestic challenges. We're facing record deficits, an overstretched defense industrial base, and political gridlock that turns every budget into a battlefield. You can't deter an adversary if your own government can't fund deterrence. Defense contractors are still struggling to refill the missile stockpiles we depleted supporting Ukraine. If a Taiwan crisis erupted tomorrow, we'd be forced to choose between fronts, and that's a choice no president should ever have to make. Now, some voices in Washington argue that we should pivot inward, that foreign entanglements drain our resources and distract us from home. I understand that instinct Americans are tired of endless wars. But this isn't about occupation or nation building. It's about preventing a world where aggression pays. The cost of deterrence is high. The cost of failure is astronomical. Think about what a Pacific War would mean. Trillions in global trade disrupted, semiconductor production halted, stock markets collapsing overnight. American workers would feel it immediately. Jobs lost, prices skyrocketing, retirement savings wiped out. That's not someone else's problem halfway around the world. That's our economy on the line. And then there's the moral limit, the fatigue of caring. We've grown used to crises that feel distant, abstract, almost cinematic, but deterrence demands sustained attention. It means investing in shipyards, in munitions, factories, in alliances that may not pay off politically but pay dividends in peace. I'll say it plainly. If America wants to prevent a war over Taiwan, we need to rebuild the machinery of deterrence. That means a Navy that can stay forward, an Air Force that can fight through denied environments, and a Congress that funds defense with the seriousness it deserves. We also need to streamline approvals for arms sales to Taiwan. Right now, our bureaucracy moves slower than our adversaries' missiles. That's unacceptable. And yet, for all these limits, America still has something Beijing doesn't: allies, innovation, and moral legitimacy. Our strength isn't just in steel, it's in the faith others place in us. When the U.S. acts decisively, it inspires. When we hesitate, it unnerves. Deterrence begins in perception, but it ends in performance. In the next section, we'll step back from the tactical and talk about the principle that must underlie everything. Why standing with Taiwan isn't just strategy. It's a statement about the kind of world we want to live in. Let me take a step back here, because beneath all the military calculations and diplomatic maneuvering lies a moral question that defines this entire issue. What does America stand for in the world today? Deterrence, at its core, isn't just a military doctrine, it's a moral one. It's the belief that freedom is worth defending, even when it's inconvenient, and that peace built on fear or surrender isn't peace at all. Taiwan represents something much larger than one island or one alliance. It's a living test of whether free societies can endure under pressure. It's a reminder that democracy isn't a natural state. It's a daily act of defiance against those who believe power, not principle, determines destiny. And I'll tell you this, when authoritarian regimes watch how America treats Taiwan, they're not simply measuring our strategy, they're measuring our soul. When I visit Texas, I meet people who might never think about the South China Sea, but they understand fairness, they understand courage, they understand what it means to stand up to a bully. And that's what this comes down to. The Chinese Communist Party believes the world runs on submission, that small nations bow, that big nations decide, and that principles bend when profit's involved. Our job, America's job, is to prove them wrong. Now, standing with Taiwan isn't about romanticizing another democracy. It's about upholding a system where the strong protect the weak, where international law means something, where sovereignty isn't erased by proximity. If we abandon that idea, we're not just risking Taiwan's future, we're redefining our own. Because if aggression goes unpunished there, it will return elsewhere, closer to home and at greater cost. Let me be clear. Deterrence isn't aggression, it's the opposite. It's the defensive order against chaos. It's the guarantee that might does not automatically make right. And for all our differences here at home, and we have plenty, this is one area where unity still matters. America's adversaries don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat. They care whether the United States still believes in itself. In this sense, Taiwan is the front line not of geography, but of principle. It's where the free world's credibility is tested in real time. You can't outsource that test, you can't delay it, and you can't fake it with statements drafted by committees. It has to come from conviction. There's a phrase I often use, peace is the dividend of clarity. When America is clear about what it stands for and what it will not tolerate, peace follows. When we equivocate, aggression fills the vacuum. The history of the 20th century proves that over and over again. We didn't keep the peace by hoping tyrants would restrain themselves. We kept it by drawing lines and holding them. That's not arrogance, it's stewardship. The same stewardship that rebuilt Europe, defended Korea, and sustained decades of stability across oceans. Taiwan now stands in that lineage. So as we near the end of this conversation, the final question isn't whether America can prevent a Pacific war. It's whether we still have the clarity, the confidence, and the courage to try. Because deterrence is not a speech, it's a daily commitment to peace through strength. And if we fail to honor it, history won't care about our excuses, it'll remember our hesitation. In the final section, I'll tell you where I believe we go from here, what concrete steps we must take right now to make sure this decade doesn't end in conflict, but in renewed peace through unmistakable strength. So where do we go from here? What does it actually mean in practical terms for the United States to prevent a Pacific war and keep peace through strength? Let me lay it out as plainly as I can. First, we rebuild our deterrent in both word and deed. That means restoring the credibility that's been eroded by years of hesitation and political division. When Beijing hears Washington speak, they shouldn't hear uncertainty, they should hear unity. The President, Congress, both parties, we need to be speaking with one voice when it comes to Taiwan, because mixed signals invite miscalculation, and miscalculation invites war. Second, we harden the Indo-Pacific theater. Forward basing, logistics, and supply lines are not luxuries, they're lifelines. We must move faster on expanding infrastructure in Guam, the Philippines, and Japan. We need joint command structures that allow real-time coordination with allies. Deterrence is not about having the biggest arsenal, it's about having the most ready one. Third, we turbocharge arms deliveries to Taiwan. That backlog of weapons Congress already approved, it's time to clear it now. Not next fiscal year, not after another round of interagency review. We should treat Taiwan like Israel as a partner under imminent threat. Get them the munitions, the anti-ship missiles, the air defense systems, and the training to use them effectively. Deterrence delayed is deterrence denied. Fourth, we strengthen the alliance network. Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the Philippines are already signaling readiness. It's our job to weave that into a coherent defense web, one that forces Beijing to see any aggression against Taiwan as an assault on the entire Pacific community. The more predictable our unity, the less tempting their gamble. Fifth, we shore up our economy. That means securing supply chains, expanding semiconductor production at home, and reducing critical dependence on Chinese imports. We can't deter China abroad while funding its rise at home. Strategic resilience starts in our factories and our ports just as much as it starts on the decks of our carriers. And finally, we tell the truth to the American people, because real deterrence isn't only military, it's moral. It requires a public that understands what's at stake and supports the cause of peace with open eyes. This is not about fighting for someone else's freedom. It's about defending the principle that has kept the world from tearing itself apart for nearly 80 years, the belief that sovereignty matters, that the strong do not prey on the weak, and that freedom, once surrendered, is rarely regained. Now, will these steps be easy? No. They'll take money, resolve, and unity in a time when both are in short supply. But history doesn't wait for comfort. The question is not whether we can afford to act, it's whether we can afford not to. Because deterrence is like oxygen, you only notice it when it's gone. Here's what I believe. Peace is still possible. The Pacific can remain stable, Taiwan can remain free, and America can remain strong if we remember who we are. We're a nation that doesn't flinch before bullies. We don't abandon friends because the odds are long. We understand that freedom, once defended, is contagious, and once lost, it's gone for generations. So yes, the stakes are enormous, but so is the opportunity to prove again that the world is safest when America leads, when strength is steady, and when peace is earned through preparation, not pleaded for through weakness. That's how we prevent a Pacific war. That's how we keep the peace. And that's how we make sure the next generation inherits a world shaped not by fear, but by freedom.